So two very insightful panellists. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. I might call to the audience if there's anyone who would like to ask a question. We've got about 20 minutes of Q&A time, and I can see someone with a hand up, otherwise I'll ask a question. Please, if you could say your name and introduce yourself and then ask the question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mary Rose. I work with Sutherland Shire Family Support Service. I am a multicultural specialist as a WDV CAS worker. So I work on the ground level, working with across the board with multicultural women and women from all backgrounds as well. Doesn't matter. So my question is, I actually wrote it down when I was thinking about it. I've written a couple of questions. Particular questions I have in my mind is about the idea of coercive control that actually has happened long before the crisis happened to the woman. And the reason that we do come across with the women is when a crisis happened and the police have intervened, and then we get to know what's been happening, whether they're going to take an AVO or not. But this has started way, way, way long time ago. So I know that coercive control has been recognised in the UK, and I'm not sure when that's going to be discussed in policy. And I know these are really the issues that actually affect a lot of women. Financial abuse, emotional abuse, and also controlling and isolating these women for so long. Thank you. That's my question.
You want to go first? Oh, it's mine. It's actually a question for a lawyer, because you're right, there's legislation in the UK that was introduced, I think about 3 years ago now, like specifically naming coercive control. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer the question as to whether that's something that we are looking at here, either within state legislation or more broadly within federal legislation. I mean, part of the problem that we have here in Australia is you have different laws and ways of working in different states and territories. So whilst we're starting to talk about, things like national AVO registers and national registers for perpetrators, we still don't have law really in this space that covers all of the states and territories, and people move. Victims, survivors and perpetrators move constantly. So I think the systems need to be connected up better. I think we're starting to shift attitudes around non-physical types of violence, particularly. I think, for me, I think the Lisa Harnham case, for me personally, was a real shift that I saw in terms of having conversations with people on the ground around that understanding of, the stalking, for example. That coercive control around, the fact that she wasn't allowed to go to work and she was told that she had to dress down. She was isolated from friends and family, systematically cut off from all of her support networks. And as you know, I mean, you're doing this stuff on the front line. As you know, this is so common. Many, many, many survivors of violence have said to me, the broken bones and bruises heal very quickly. It's scars, it's physical things, but it's the psychological stuff that is really difficult to recover from. And I think we've got a real gap in terms of, some of that longer term psychological support as well. We don't fund it particularly well. Women are lucky if they're able to connect up with things like the Women's Counselling Service here in the Inner West, but those sorts of things don't exist everywhere. I think I would like to defer to police on this, because I think it'd be interesting to see how New South Wales Police and other policing jurisdictions feel about coercive control, because my understanding is a lot of that actually came from police in the UK and police working really closely with Women's Aid. But I think police have got a lot better at understanding what coercive control is and being able to proceed without having the physical evidence that you necessarily used to have. So. Thank you.
Myself on. Okay. I think coercive control, it's important. I think we're a long way from there, to be honest, but it's also from a policing and legislation point of view, it'd be extremely difficult to prove. So I think
legislators are more willing to bring in legislation that is going to stand up easily, and developments that we're going to have over the next, I would say, 3 to 10 years are going to be more things that are going to not get runs on the board, but politicians like to see results. So unless we can get better at determining how to prove those events over a long period of time, I think it's going to be challenging, I'd say, to get that happening in New South Wales and other jurisdictions in Australia.
Yeah, and it may not be prevalent in that exact terminology, but as we know, domestic or family violence extends beyond physical abuse. There is the emotional, the psychological, the financial control. I mean, that doesn't necessarily encompass the full extent of coercive control, but there's some manifestations which are in the current definition.
Can I just add as well to that? I think we were talking about this earlier just at lunch, the idea that people don't necessarily see themselves as a victim survivor. So until you get after the fact and somebody says to you, that was really abusive, it can often be really hard to spot that you're in that situation. And I think if we can educate people better about what coercive control looks like and the range of types of behaviour, it means that we'll be able to have those conversations with women who might not see themselves as the typical victim, whatever that is. So, you know, we talk a lot to some of the women who live up in, you know, incredibly wealthy houses on the North Shore, and there might be 4 or 5 big, shiny, brand new cars parked outside their house. And they might be, you know, wealthy on paper but have absolutely no access to income. And we know that, you know, their husband is tracking the kilometres on the clock of their car before they drop kids off to school. And if she's done 5 kilometres more, he wants to know where she's been and make her account for that kind of stuff. So it's not just, you know, there's a range of ways in which you can coercively control your partner. And we need to better understand that, I think, in the mainstream.
My name's Georgina Dent and I'm an editor at Women's Agenda. My question is, as a member of the media, this year there's been, I mean, the numbers are horrendous, the number of deaths, and we know that the deaths is only the, you know, pointy end of, it's not the only problem, but it's a sort of fairly extreme representative of how bad things are. This year has been particularly horrific, in it, not just in terms of women being killed, but in children being killed. Julie and Moo, what are you seeing in terms of at the front line? Is this problem getting worse, like the numbers seem to suggest?
Hard question to answer, because I think a lot of homicides over the history of time have been hidden.
Yes.
And so it wasn't, now it's in the community spotlight. We're talking about things more. A story about a DV homicide now will go on the front page of the paper, whereas maybe a couple of years ago it actually wouldn't have. And now we have survivors that are speaking out that haven't been killed, that are getting more publicity. So I think it's not a topic for discussion, but people are more interested in it, so it has more longevity in the media. I'm not saying it's better or worse, and like you say, there have been some horrific instances over the past 12 to 18 months of children being killed, but I don't think it's necessarily statistically that different to 5 years ago.
Yeah, hi Georgie, long time no see. It's really interesting talking to services on the ground. Frontline caseworkers will tell you they think the violence is increasing. If you have a conversation with Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia, for example, they'll say to you, and 1800 Respect as well, they'll say there are huge spikes in calls to them when there's something on TV about an incident. You know, when you see those horrific, just heartbreaking stories of a woman and multiple children being killed, I have to wonder. It's anecdotal, and I don't think anybody is doing proper research into this yet to try and work out whether the spikes in violence are just something that, you know, we think we're seeing and we're tracking better, or whether it's an actual increase. But absolutely, I would agree. I think we're probably getting better at identifying homicides that in the past we might have thought were not necessarily domestic related. Certainly, I had somebody talking to me recently about looking at the number of suicides as well, because I don't think that we're tracking anything in that space around the number of women who commit suicide, who are potentially long-term survivors of intimate partner violence and then have just had enough. And as far as I know, really, it's hard because you look at New South Wales police stats and, you know, our minister will say that the numbers are going down. I honestly don't believe from what happens when I go out and talk with services that violence is decreasing or that there is less violence being perpetrated across New South Wales. I think police stats are one thing. I think calls to helplines are another thing. And I think there's a lot of fear out there as well.
I guess the other thing is because it is being reported more and it is being discussed more, perhaps there are people who are recognising more that actually what is happening to them is not acceptable, you know, whereas previously they might have thought, well, there's no support for me in this situation, so maybe that is why people are calling more. Anyway, it's very interesting. Thank you both very much for your time.
Yeah, it's certainly twofold: increased awareness, but also potentially if we get more data and more research in the area, we might be able to gather whether it's actually increased or it's a result of the increased awareness. I will be coming to this side. Just one question over there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Anne Ali, the Labor MP, she made some comments earlier this week where, and I'll paraphrase very crudely, that perhaps domestic violence is as great a threat or, you know, equal to or greater than terrorism. And of course, you know, there's political discussions as to whether or not that's correct or not. But I was wondering, from your perspective, when it comes to legislation and also sociocultural perspectives around domestic violence and ensuring that the right amount of funding gets directed towards, you know, these critical services and for, implementing some of those changes you were both flagging, do we as a society in Australia need to start thinking about domestic violence in the same way that we think about terrorism in order to try to, you know, affect that real change?
I'm looking at my police colleague here first, deferring to you.
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, it's society's perspective. So a terrorism event obviously there was one in Melbourne last week, but, you know, we have no tolerance for one person being killed as a society. If there was a terrorist outside in Pitt Street on our way home, someone got killed, zero tolerance. We'd talk about it for weeks. A woman can get killed. Left, right, centre, there was one this week. We're not going to talk about that for weeks. So is it a big problem? Well, more people are affected by it, definitely. It invades, I would say there wouldn't be a school in New South Wales that didn't have children in it that were affected by family violence. So it's a society problem, whereas, yes, as a society, we're fearful of terrorists. As a police force, we do everything we can to protect society from terrorists, but you're far more likely to encounter domestic violence in your day-to-day life. So, yeah, that's definitely a interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I think Rosie has talked quite publicly about the correlation and called it domestic terrorism. I mean, yeah, definitely the resources that we put into responding to the crisis part of domestic and family violence are just minuscule in comparison with things like the resources put into legislative change and responses in terms of things like one punch up in the cross, or you know, the tiny number of actual domestic terrorism incidents that we've seen on the streets in Australia. So yeah. I guess it's just extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, we've got a long way to go politically on this, haven't we? I think you know, counting dead women, 61 women have been murdered this year, most of them by somebody that they knew or were in some kind of intimate partnership with. You know, we've far surpassed last year's numbers already, and I wonder what it takes, really. And yeah, one person in Melbourne, which is awful and a tragedy, but you know, you think about the resources. I think it's fascinating with domestic violence because we always have to wait for an inquest process, and you know, in New South Wales we have a fantastic structure called the New South Wales Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. Anna Butler and her team down there at the Coroner's Court do incredible investigations into all domestic violence related homicides, and we learn a lot from that, about what could be done better, and police are a part of that, and family and community services and other parts of government and non-government. But that takes a long time. So, we're working with some survivor advocates to run a rally up in Martin Place on 25th of November. At the moment, we're trying to determine how many people have died this year in New South Wales as a result of domestic violence, and we might have to wait 2 or 3 years for some of those inquests to report. Whereas with a terrorism-related incident, I think, we're able to say quite definitively within 24 hours or so. Police seem quite quick to name those things, and governments and politicians as well. So it's interesting, isn't it?
Okay.
Just a quick note with the lady that was talking earlier. We know New South Wales Crimes Act Section 87 identifies children with coercion and harbouring, but the Domestic Violence Act doesn't identify coercion at all, not even for children, which is almost unfathomable, I think, that we don't identify coercion as part of domestic violence. That's the first thing. Secondly, thank you, ladies, for your input today. It's just amazing to be with such wonderful people. When you were talking, especially with regards to the police, we have incidences throughout Australia where we have obviously children regarding domestic violence, and with education as well. Tell me views for both of you, what your views are with regards to children actually having access to being represented in courts of law. Currently, we don't have any representation of children in civil matters, and domestic violence is still identified as a civil matter, not a criminal matter. And so earlier this year, the Domestic Violence and Family Law Support Network started a process to be able to get children to get legal representation. We've been working with the Children's Commissioner and the ATO, actually, for lawyers to be able to donate services for children. I find it amazing that people don't see the children as victims. They get identified on ADVOs as named persons. Very rarely are they pin-ops, which is just crazy. We've said, everybody I think that's spoken today has said there cannot possibly be a child that's not affected by this. Really, we need to educate our children and let them know this is not acceptable. And with that, I'm sure our children will be able to take our culture from society into the next generation.
Yeah, I support and agree with what you're saying, but it's from the police perspective, we have certain procedures when we go to domestic and family violence incidents, and we'll ensure the children are named in the ADVO, but it's whether they're named as a child or a pin-op, they're still on there. It's complicated, like you say, with not being represented. It's I guess that's the whole new world that we're moving towards.
I think we're failing children in a range of ways, not just in terms of the court system and laws, but also in terms of recognising the impacts on children. And there's no excuse. We know what this is doing to children in utero and as babies and infants and young children and young people as well. I firmly believe that in a generation's time we'll have people who were young, who were growing up with this, who will come back and say, you had an opportunity to protect me, you knew the impacts and the prevalence of this violence and you did nothing. And they would have every right to do so, because we're failing to give children responses as clients in their own right within, refuges in the crisis system. We're failing to support them through and support them as clients through the legal system as well. And there's a lot more that we could be doing, but it all requires resources, and everybody is stretched, and that's part of the problem. I think the family law court is an institution that absolutely needs to be microscopically examined in terms of the impacts on children, because the fact that we still have a system that says it's better for two parents to have equal access, even when we know and we have files, significant files saying this dad has sexually abused his child, and we're still giving him full custody or equal access. I just think that's, there's a lot. The whole lid needs to be blown on the family court. It's not a system that is supporting kids, and it's not supporting victim survivors either.
Just one more thing. For a long time, I've spoken to other people with regards to the possibility of when there are police who attend a DV incident in a family home, are the police looking at, and obviously you're only speaking for New South Wales, are the police looking at any opportunities for actually having DV officers attend those sorts of incidences? Because it seems to be that the police, from my experience, police will attend and do what they can and then sort of hand over a phone number or make an appointment to see someone that's with a DV unit. But there's no one that's actually DV specialised that attends incidences, it seems to me.
I can only talk for New South Wales, obviously, at the moment. We're almost headed towards that a little bit more than we were. There's all the regions now have a high-risk DV team, but they're not first responders. So the reality is that at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not going to get a DV specialist that's at work in the hope that there's a DV event. We all have to be generous, a bit like ambulance officers. You know, you might want the heart specialist to come for your heart attack, but they're going to come for your broken leg too. So, and that's just the way, unfortunately, of the world. We don't have the resources to train a DV specialist to be at a police station. I mean, for example, Parramatta, as you know, is a pretty busy area. I have 2 trucks working on a night shift, so that's 4 police. So I don't have the facility to put, 2 DV specialists on a truck in the hope that they go to a DV event. So it's, I think, in utopia, I'd have specialists for car accidents, I'd have specialists for DV, I'd have specialists for all kinds of events. But the reality is, you're just going to get a generalist. But we are getting definitely better as an organisation of having more DVLOs, DV operatives to focus on the offenders. So we're definitely improving in that regard. But your first response is going to be a first responder.
And are most police officers given some DV training now?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, every police officer. I'm not saying that's a substitute in any way, but there's at least some training being given to all the police officers.
Do you like that idea of utopia though?
Well, I actually don't think, when you think of how much time it takes of New South Wales Police, it's a significant chunk of their work. I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think every police officer, particularly the GDs who are there doing that frontline stuff day after day, should be doing a significant chunk of training every year, because things change quickly, right? Not just the legislative stuff, but also what we know and understand. And it's not that there aren't a lack of services that would be really willing to do that work locally as well. I also think we've got a lot better in terms of the number of DVLOs, domestic violence liaison officers, but we could improve a lot there too. I was out in Griffith last week. They've got a part-time domestic violence liaison officer, and she's there 3 days a week, and she's doing that and probably, a whole heap more of her job. And her job is really to review all of the domestic violence cases that come through in that local area command, to also, I guess, build the capacity and knowledge a bit within that police station as well. It's a big responsibility. And a huge area, yeah. I think we should be putting a lot more resourcing into police.
We all know police are so under-resourced. We all know that. There's certainly no disrespect there whatsoever.
No, but I understand your desire for specialists, but I would think most frontline police now are going to a domestic violence incident, probably most shifts. So by default, they're becoming specialists. So
We're conscious of the time. We probably have time for one more question.
I almost could have been sitting in Canada listening to this discussion, because everything that's been said, observed, stated, and the questions, it still prevails, way across the Pacific pond. And it makes me think that, we really do need to have a profound shift here. And it has to come from the highest levels, and we need culture change on this. We've seen a little bit on things like we put rape under the criminal code in Canada and then reclassified it as sexual violence. And in that set, we got more, with more convictions, people came forward, de-gendrifying things and looking at it as a human rights issue as opposed to a gender issue, and so on and so forth. So I just want to, in that sense, saying I think it's really important that this discussion continues and is dominant in an international level. I note that on the 15th of November starts the 16-day. Sorry?
Next week, 25th.
25th. Oh, did I say the 16th? Sorry. So everybody knows about it. Yeah, well, that's what I was just going to say here. So Orange the World, hashtag Hear Me Too. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of all of this today.
Can I just comment on that, because I think we learn a lot from our sisters and brothers in Canada, and I think particularly about the horrific number of Aboriginal women who've gone missing there, or who are victim survivors of violence. And we, there was an amazing young Aboriginal journalist who made a documentary last year that was shown here in Australia around the correlation between the violence that Aboriginal women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women here in Australia face on a day-to-day basis in so many communities, and what it looks like and what we can learn from Canada as well. So we've got a long way to go, but there's a lot that we can learn from each other.
Certainly, I think today was very informative and engaging and interactive, which is what we wanted. And there's quite a few areas that have been identified, and that's the whole point of having a discussion like this, because if we're talking about it, we never want to just have a talk fest. We want to actually look at what are some concrete areas where we can work on or improve the service delivery, or there could be potential areas for reform. And, a lot of you who are working on the ground, the grassroots level, I think you've identified some really important areas. And, of course, gathering statistics, which is an ongoing part of the National Action Plan, but is something that we, hopefully by the end of 2022, that's when it's concluding, but that will continue on. And so will this lecture series as well. We'll probably try and have someone from the government at the next lecture series, so they can also address you firsthand. And also from an interreligious point of view, having a look at it from different religious standpoints. So we'll have some religious presenters as well. Thank you, both of you, again for your time. I would now like to call on Leslie Dalton, who's the Regional Director of the New South Wales ACT Department of Home Affairs, to present a gift to Moo Baulch from the DV New South Wales. Thank you. Thank you, Moo. I'd also like to call Angela Bogdan, the Consul General for Canada in Sydney, to present a gift to Superintendent Julie Boon. Thank you. Before I invite Emmett, the Executive Director of the Affinity Intercultural Foundation, I would also like to thank Zia Sahin, who's the board member of Galaxy Foundation. She's been the generous sponsor of today's program. So I'd like to invite Moo and Julie to present a small gift as a token of Affinity's appreciation, and Zia will also stay back to say a few words. And thank you again also to everyone who's attended today. It'll be maybe good if we all network a bit after the seminar concludes, exchange cards and information. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am here on behalf of Galaxy Foundation. We are an organisation that was established in 1997, a non-government organisation. We are involved in educational, charitable and humanitarian initiatives. And not only do we organise our own ones, but we also support organisations that work along the same lines. So we've been supporting Affinity since Affinity's inception. We've been sponsoring their events and so on. And I actually worked at Affinity a few years back. I worked here for 2 years. And so Galaxy was funding us. Now we're funding them, kind of thing. So I'm one of the few people who is able to say that. Just the discussion today was really interesting for me because I just recently supervised HSC exams in a school. And there was a kid there that I've known for a very long time from his really young ages. He was sitting the HSC exams. And I noticed for a lot of his exams, he just left empty papers. He wouldn't write anything. He would just leave it empty. He would just sit there for 3 hours or 2 hours, hardly writing anything and just leaving the exam. He actually turned up late to one of the exams, and then upon investigating why he's like that, I found out that his parents were going through a messy divorce, and there've been huge family problems, maybe some domestic violence involved as well. And so it's really interesting to come here today and hear those sort of things, because as you said, there's probably no kid who's not affected by things like this. As I said, Galaxy sponsors Affinity Sings because they do work along the same lines, and working here, now being on the board of Galaxy Foundation, we know where the money's going, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.